An essential first step is changing 336 so there is no compliance loophole. And that comes back to a matter of legislation. That's something the Congress has to do. The FAA cannot change it. In fact, the court has told them they cannot change it. It's bitterly opposed by the AMA, though they now recognize there's going to have to be some give. And that's where we sit.
You're listening to the Drone Radio Show podcast, the show about drones and the people who use them for business, fun, and research. Hosted by Randy Goers.
Hello, everyone. This is Randy Goers, and welcome to the Drone Radio Show podcast, episode 173. Why isn't the FAA moving faster on regulations that will advance the drone industry? If you ask today's guest, he might say that we need to look in an entirely different direction. Chris Korody is the founder of the DroneBusiness.Center and provides strategy, research, and content for the UAV, IoT, and robotics industries. He has more than 45 years of marketing experience and has worked with some of the largest companies in the technology field, including Apple, BMW, Boeing, Cisco, Intel, Rockwell, Xerox, and many others. Chris produces the weekly newsletter Dronin On, which focuses on the global regulatory environment and is widely followed by senior managers in law firms, regulatory agencies, and businesses around the world. In this edition of the Drone Radio Show, Chris talks about some of the current UAS legislative initiatives, the respective roles of the FAA and Congress in passing bills and regulations, and how drone operators can prepare themselves for what may lie ahead. Interdrone 2018 is the largest commercial UAV and drone conference with nearly 3,500 attendees, 120 sessions, and more than 175 exhibitors. The show will be held in Las Vegas on September 5th through 7th. Make your plans now to attend. Use the code PARTNER and receive $100 off the purchase price of admission. Now, before we hear from Chris, I want to thank those of you who have been supporting my funding campaign on Patreon. For as little as $1 per month, you can help defray the costs of production and keep the podcast going and growing. Go to patreon.com/Drone Radio Show to join the team. Now let's get an update on the current legislative and regulatory initiatives on drones with Christopher Korody of the DroneBusiness.Center. Let's pick up the interview where I asked Chris to introduce himself.
So my name is Chris Korody. I am the founder of the DroneBusiness.Center, and I write and publish a free weekly newsletter for the commercial UAS industry called Dronin On. And I try to connect the dots as impacts people within the industry. You know, what's going on with regulation, what's going on with business, what's going on with technology, so that people can hopefully use that to make better informed decisions for their own companies.
Chris, you've been tracking the UAS legislative efforts for some time now. What do you see happening on the federal level as it relates to drones?
That's a great place to start, Randy. So I didn't intend to end up giving civics lessons. I did take poli-sci in college, but, we're really deep into government here. And there's a critical concept that I think is important for people to understand, and that is the Congress creates legislation. They provide instructions to regulatory agencies like the FAA about what they're supposed to do. They do the same thing with the Department of Transportation. They do the same thing with numerous agencies. And from that, what the FAA does is make rules. They create regulation. So as people look at what's going on, there's a definite line between what the FAA can do independently to solve some of the problems that we're all seeing versus what they need to have legislation to empower them to do.
In your opinion, what's the most pressing legislative initiative right now?
Well, the big problem is what's called Section 336 and then the proposed remote identification rule. And let me just kind of take you and the listeners through the history of this. Section 336 is part of the 2012 FAA reauthorization bill that the Congress wrote. This is when the FAA historically was instructed to integrate drones into the national airspace. So this is where it all started. And there was what was called a carve-out. A carve-out is a special set of exemptions. In this case, basically for modelers who, have been operating model aircraft for something like 80 years under an old rule called the 97 rule, and they didn't really bother anybody, and the rule was one page, and it basically said, fly under the community-based organization, fly from designated airstrips, keep away from the airplanes, and everybody will be happy. And that worked great because, we're talking about people who spent hours and years building beautiful models, and that took real skill to fly, and they had to take them off from strips, and there was a lot of peer support, peer pressure, and, it worked fine. And when in 2012, the AMA very effectively lobbied to maintain this carve-out that the FAA would not regulate modelers. And in fact, Jim Williams wrote an article about that for the newsletter where he talked about, at the time, nobody understood what was about to happen, right? So 336 gets put in place, and then people will remember that the FAA published a registration rule at Christmas of 2015. They were concerned about the million-odd models, drones that were going to get sold, and nobody understood the rules. And at the time, the AMA rightly advised their members not to comply with the rule. And in fact, then last summer, a gentleman named Dr. Taylor, I think in Maryland, brought a suit, Taylor versus Huerta, in which he sued the FAA saying that the registration rule was illegal and did not apply to 336, right? And then you might remember that the court found in Taylor's favor, and then there was a whole thing about whether recreational flyers would get their $5 registration back or not. And to finish that story, before I go on to the other part of it, and this goes right back to legislation versus regulation. So what happened essentially was a regulation that the FAA made was deemed illegal. And the only way to fix the problem was through legislation. And in fact, the registration rule was reinstated by the Congress as a piece of legislation in the 2018 National Defense Authorization Appropriation Act, or Bill, NDAA it's called. And now registration resumed, right? So now let's take a look at remote ID, which is what everybody is focused on because it is essentially the precursor for all the extended operations. If you ask most people, who at least I talk to, well, what do you care about? What do you want? What do you want to be able to do? What does your business depend on? What do they say? They say, well, I want to fly over people. They want to fly beyond visual line of sight. I want to fly at night. I want to fly delivery. So if we group all of that as extended operations, and night's becoming pretty routine, the FAA looks at all that and says, okay, well, what do we have to do it?
So now we're getting into the rulemaking process. Maybe you can talk about what that entails and how it works.
So the FAA makes rules, and a lot of times they have an ARC. They create an ARC, an advisory rule committee, to provide them with advice from stakeholders. That's also the function of the DAC, the Drone Advisory Committee. And then they draft a rule, and they have to send it the way that works because they're an executive agency, part of the Department of Transportation. They have to send it to the White House Office of Management and Budget, to a department called OIRA, which is the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. And OIRA is sort of the clearinghouse for all the proposed legislation that's going to get done, and they're also charged with determining the economic impact of the bill. So when this bill to fly over people went to OIRA, OIRA is also a place where both private stakeholders and federal agencies can give input to the rule. And usually what happens is that input goes back to the FAA or to the publishing agency, and they make some changes based on the feedback, and then they publish what's called the NPRM, a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, for public comment, which is what happened with Part 107. And then that becomes, with feedback from the public comment, that becomes published as a rule. So Flight Over People went to OIRA in January of 2017, and immediately the three security agencies, which is the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, and the DOJ, Department of Justice, most of the FBI, said, no, we're not going to let that allow you to make a rule like that until we know who is up there, right? Until we can tell the good guys from the bad guys, the friendlies from the unfriendlies, the authorized from the unauthorized. And coincidentally, the FAA had already been instructed by Congress in the 2016 extension, because there was no reauthorization, there was an extension to fund them, to create a remote ID rule. So they convened a remote ID ARC, which turned in their report in December of 2017, right? And so there are two things worth noting. The first was that the ARC split. There was a minority group that dissented with a majority opinion because the recommendation did not include all UAVs, all drones. And so we can just, I like to use the term universal remote ID. It's not entirely accurate. I don't think anybody wants to put remote ID on a 250-gram, $70 drone that can't fly out of your living room. But the bigger issue now, if you think back to it, was Section 336, which basically, again, said FAA was not to regulate modelers. And if you think back at Taylor versus Huerta, what we now come down to is that anybody, when it comes to trying to publish a remote ID rule, anybody who claims to be a modeler flying under the rules of a community-based organization could ignore the requirement. And here's the problem, and it's the problem that the dissenting group and the ARC had. There are maybe right now, and I say maybe, 1.2 million registered drones. We last heard 1.1, so let's just assume the number continues to grow, call it 1.2. And of those, somewhere around now, 125,000, maybe 150,000 are registered commercial drones, which means that pilot has registered a specific drone. If he owns 3 drones, he has 3 registrations. As opposed to, we remember a recreational registration is one pilot, many drones. Maybe 200,000, somewhere around 200,000 are flying under a community-based organization, mostly the AMA. And the rest of them, let's call it 900,000 of the 1.2 million, are simply registered. And there's another unknown number, probably north of 1 million, that isn't registered at all. So now if you're a security agency, you say, well, yeah, that's great, and I understand that there's this problem, but you're not solving my problem. I still don't know who's up there. So this is obviously a complicated problem to solve, and we can talk or not talk about some of my ideas about solving it, but the bottom line is an essential first step is changing 336 so there is no compliance loophole, and that comes back to a matter of legislation. That's something the Congress has to do. The FAA cannot change it. In fact, the court has told them they cannot change it. It's bitterly opposed by the AMA, though they now recognize there's going to have to be some give. And that's where we sit. So if we look at the FAA reauthorization bill, which is what funds the FAA, what happens is the House writes a bill, in this case it was called H.R. 4, and then the Senate writes a bill, and then the two bills meet in Congress, in conference, and they, both chambers, the House and the Senate, have to agree on the final bill that's negotiated before it can go to the President to be signed. So in H.R. 4, in the House version, there were 2 amendments that addressed 336 specifically. One is called the DeFazio Amendment, and one is the Sanford Amendment. Those are the sponsoring congressmen. There is nothing in the Senate bill, and so I think it's entirely possible we go to Interdrone with no resolution on this. And in fact, it's hard to say how long it'll take to resolve it. I mean, there have been some noises coming out of the Senate that they want to get their bill passed, but even then, the 2 chambers have to meet in conference. And, you know, it's pretty simple. If they don't change 336, then there sits the industry. And if they change 336, then of course we have to see what they change it to, and then people can start to worry about the completely non-compliant drones who that are just simply flying, that are being sold every day at Best Buy and on Amazon, and are simply out there flying. But again, this is the classic example of the legislation has to go before the regulation and the rule.
Do you get a sense of anyone trying to move things forward?
The 336 specifically, no. I rely on a handful of publications and a handful of people who share information with me. But what struck me as sort of surprising was that there was no Senate amendment to address this. And there's about 40 amendments proposed to the Senate bill, and about 8 or 10 of them have to do with UAS, and none of them address it. So I was a little surprised by that, honestly.
What are you hearing from the various stakeholders? I mean, I would expect the drone industry in particular would have something to say.
The industry needs it. I don't mean to be divisive, but I think that as we move forward, it's increasingly clear that the interests of the recreational industry, which is basically the retail and Chinese export industries, are different from the interests of the commercial drone industry. And they will continue to diverge. And I think that I wrote recently, that presents a problem, an increasing problem for the FAA and probably for Congress, because you're going to have to start to legislate these things somewhat differently in the same way that you have general aviation and commercial aviation. There's a pattern for it. So I think there's a lot of frustrated people. There's a lot of people wishing something would happen. And I think, I appreciate the chance to talk about it, Randy, because part of it is that people understand that this isn't entirely the FAA's doing. It's easy to throw rocks at the FAA, but it's not entirely up to them. They don't have the power to solve this problem.
You mentioned reauthorization. Can that be a vehicle for addressing this need?
So the FAA reauthorization, so the way it works, and I couldn't tell you why, but it's worked for a long time. If you think back, I mentioned the 2012 reauthorization. The FAA, like other executive branches, have to be reauthorized by the Congress. And that's a formal process. And usually as part of that process, there's a budget. And as part of that process, there are various instructions to the department. So if you went back and looked at the 2016 one, which is the federal extension, there were like 13 UAS-specific instructions, which included things like remote ID, it included things like developing UTM, it included things like Section 2209, which is allowing private industry infrastructure owners to designate their facilities as no-fly zone, for the FAA to come up with a way to manage a designation no-fly zone. So not all these things get addressed, and not all these things get budgeted, but this is part of the reauthorization process. So, without getting too far into politics, we can see that the Congress is not working terribly efficiently. So I think everybody's hope was that the FAA reauthorization, since this is a FAA-specific rule, would be a very logical place to address 336. And I think a lot of people were hopeful that it would be done by now. I don't think anybody I've spoken with sees that trying to bring up 336 as an independent piece of legislation all by its lonesome would be a particularly desirable way to go. There's been a tremendous amount of lobbying going on from the security agencies to both the Senate and the House, saying they needed, this is the DHS authorization to start shooting things down and start testing gear. I've watched a lot of testimony to both the Senate and the House, the FAA, the DOD, DOJ, not DOD so much, but DOJ and DHS all saying, we need remote ID, we need to be able to do this. Even finally, by the end of it, people talking about 336 directly. So the message is out there. It's just a little unclear how this is going to get sorted out. But I think that this is the place to do it. And I mean, realistically, if you think about it, if we don't get it done now, then by the time the elections are over, you're going to have a new Congress and or a largely new, some percentage of the group will be gone, and there'll be a new group in place, and it'll be start all over in 2018.
Is there a deadline for reauthorization?
I think I read 55 days out. But, there's two parts to it, and most of it's funding. And I read somewhere, I'm trying to get some more information about it, but I read in one of the commercial aviation newsletters that funding for the FAA for 2019 was passed as part of a minibus package along with some other appropriations. So I suppose the funding is in place. Now, if they don't do a reauthorization, they do an extension. And again, that requires, the houses to vote on it. Last time, you might remember in 2016, there was the whole privatization of air traffic control, and the House couldn't do anything, and the Senate passed theirs, and everybody went along with it to keep the sky open. So, in 57 days, 55 days, whatever it is, by the time people hear it, fewer days than that, they'll be running out of money, but I think that will be handled. They don't have to act on 336 particularly.
Okay, so what should people take away from all of this?
Well, I think that we are a waiver nation, right now, and that the people who are operating, whether they're employees and in-house employees or whether they're drone service providers, should be maxing out the waivers that are useful to them, because that's the one thing they can count on being able to do right now. The other part of it that we really haven't discussed is that the rulemaking process typically takes 2 to 3 years. So let's say 336, just for argument's sake, is done in 2018, and now you start the clock ticking on some of this stuff in 2019. You could be 2021, 2022 before some of these rules come to be. And in fact, if you look at some of the known timeline that the FAA has already published, some of this stuff isn't even scheduled to start rulemaking until 2019 or 2020. So, I think that we're the waiver nation right now.
Really, waivers?
One of the interesting things is there's been webinar after webinar, and the FAA is really to be commended this summer. They're doing a series of 4 or 5 different webinars. I call them wavinars now, on how to get waivers. And a lot of the law firms are stepping up and doing sessions, on the same topic. And, there's getting to be a body of knowledge, but everybody recognizes that the waiver will never scale and wants to get to a rule so that instead of having to make up your own safety case, you can just follow a published safety case. So that's, the longer term goal, but it's going to take a while to get there.
How difficult is it to get a waiver?
It's interesting. Kevin Morris, who runs a lot of that stuff for the FAA, I saw a quote from him saying that of the waiver applications in 2018, 16% have been approved.
That's not a very high success rate, considering it's pretty much the only way to go right now.
No, it's not a high success rate, especially, just for humor, if you think about Part 107, the success rate's 92, 93%. There's clearly room for improvement. I think a lot of it, one of the reasons that all these webinars are going on right now and the FAA is doing theirs is because, people don't know how to do it. There's nothing intuitive about it. It's very detailed, and you basically have to convince somebody you don't know, who doesn't know you, that you've thought through the problem to the extent where you've identified all the risks and you have a plan for mitigating each of the risks, and you taken the time to literally write it down and explain it in a way that makes sense to some regulator somewhere in a building somewhere. And it's like school, right?
But I think we have to give the FAA some credit in recognizing that they're extremely limited in what they can do. They are promoting the only tool that maybe they have at their disposal right now. And as challenging as it is, it's at least giving the industry a pathway to follow.
Yeah, no, exactly. I couldn't agree with you more. They're definitely to be commended. They're committed to making it work. It's just an incredibly painful process for everybody involved, but that's, I think, where we are. And I think that if people see business opportunities or see business requirements, then they need to invest the time in figuring out the waiver thing, because it's the only thing you can take to the bank for the next 12 to 24 months anyway.
And this is one of those situations where, as frustrating as it is, people really shouldn't be taking it out on the FAA. Instead, they should be putting some pressure on their congressperson. Because like you say, this is not something that falls directly to the FAA until the law changes.
No, it's not. There's nothing they can do. I mean, they're doing what they can do. In fact, by the time we all get to Interdrone in Las Vegas, the Lance program will be coming to the end, the beta program, and, it'll be interesting to see how that's worked. But there's an example of, the FAA having private-public partnership, work with a bunch of companies to create a good solution for the industry that seems, by all accounts, to be working well and has solved a problem in a very tangible way. People can push a button and get an authorization to go fly. Or not. At least they know, right?
Do you think we'll get any clarity or announcements at Interdrone on the status of the FAA rulemaking or the legislative initiatives?
I'm moderating the FAA panel, and we have the unique pleasure of following Acting Administrator Elwell's keynote. So we'll be there to, I hope, comment on what we hear, but I think, I've thought a little bit about what's he going to talk about. Well, I'm sure he's going to mention the Lance beta because it's been a big success. I'm hoping he shares some utilization numbers. We get an idea of, how many missions are being flown, what kind of activity levels there are. You might also remember that they started with a dozen private companies participating in the development, and then that rolled out to 5 companies who were the original, I think they're called USS suppliers, is Skyward Verizon, AirMap, Boeing, Rockwell Collins, and somebody else. And they've indicated that they were going to add more USS suppliers, so he may talk about that. I think a lot of attention will be on UAS IPP. You remember that the 10 cities, the 10 programs were awarded, and as I understand it, all the programs were required to be operational by the end of August. And so that, we're 1 week after that. I don't think that there will be any findings or learnings yet, but everybody will be up in the air and have started. And I think we should come back to that because that's really an awful lot of people are hanging their hat on the UAS IPP right now. I think we'll hear about Part 107 being over 100,000 people, keeping in mind that that's not just commercial operators. There's also recreational operators who choose not to operate under 336. But I think the UAS IPP, I would expect, will be the major piece of noise he's going to make. The ULC, the Uniform Law Commission, has come out with a drone tort law that basically suggests that drone operators have to get permission to fly over private property at any altitude below 200 feet. As you can imagine, the reaction to that is none too popular among the drone community. And a lot of people are saying, well, UAS IPP, is this place where hopefully a partnership between the federal, the state, the local, the tribal governments can start to define some of these issues. And in fact, Jim Poss, who's a retired Air Force general, wrote a brilliant thing about it that I ran a few weeks ago, and he basically said the number one job of those 10 groups should be to figure out what the right operating altitude, where the jurisdiction handoff is, because technically we know that the FAA owns from the grass to the god, right? But practically speaking, drones take off and land in local areas that the FAA doesn't regulate. So to try to make sense out of how all that works, I think is really something that was behind the intent of the program, and I think it's something that the FAA is really looking for, is to try to understand, what kind of regulations are necessary, what makes sense, what can reasonably or safely be handed off to local and state government, where do they have to keep a firmer hand in. I heard Greg from AirMap did an InterDrone interview, and he talked about an analogy between with automobiles where the federal government is involved in establishing what basically become a uniform national safety standard, but it's up to the local community to figure out, is that a stop sign or a walk sign, or should there be a zebra stripe, or, what's needed. And I don't know that the analogy plays all the way through, but I do think that the FAA is not set up to manage this at that level. Local communities need to be involved. There was a famous quote from Ed Lee at one of the first DACs where, he was the mayor of San Francisco, he just passed away, and he said, and I like the quote very much, he said, all of a sudden my whole city's an airport. And so there has to be a partnership here, and I think, UASIPP has 3 years to run. How fast they will be taking lessons learned from that and how fast they can turn that into regulation or rules, I don't know. I don't think they know, but it started, and I would expect, Administrator Elwell to talk a lot about that.
Last year, there seemed to be a lot of talk about preemption. What are you hearing now?
Well, the ULC thing is smack preemption right there. They're saying, hey, 200 feet and below, that's a tort if you fly your drone into that person's space, whether you do an injury to them or not. And you think about it, how ridiculous is it? I'm lying around my swimming pool with my koozie looking up, and there's a drone, and I'm sure that's 200 feet or lower, and I know who it is. I don't think so. It's going to be a messy piece of law. They're saying, well, if it's uniform like that, it's going to minimize lawsuits, is their argument. But in fact, there's a lot of people saying this is going to cause more problems. So that's the preemption piece, and I think that's the hope for UASIPP. Some people have suggested to me over the past months, well, hey, maybe it's their sort of way of saying, why don't you just wait and let us try to figure this out before you go nuts with the local rules. The problem is that it's very clear, the FAA has made it very clear, and it's not in their charter to worry about privacy. And so now we get to the whole privacy thing, and I always say that a drone is a buzzing reminder of the last time your credit card got hacked, right? So, when it comes to personal cybersecurity, if you will, to privacy, that's the local people going to their local town council or their local mayor or their local state senator or their local governor saying you have to do something. These things are terrible. And, it's a problem. I mean, it's real. I think that the concerns are sometimes justified, sometimes not. But as then you start to say, well, I want to fly over people, and the FAA can say, well, okay, you can fly over people because you're going BVLOS and you're going from here to there and you're going to go over people along the way. You're going to run into this whole individual privacy thing, which is going to get fought at a local level.
Tell us how your InterDrone session is going to unfold.
The intention is that, we provide an update. We've got 4 people on the panel, and, I'm kind of looking forward. I'm hoping that I can talk everybody into at least coming in with some issues they're looking to hear from the administrator on and talking about what he did or didn't say. I mean, I spend an ungodly amount of time on this every week. I hope most people don't. And it's hard to keep track of it all. There's so many different layers to it and so many moving parts. And, he could talk about any number of things. And so I hope that we can help people get a sense of what's said and also what remains undone and where they're going. I mean, as we started, Randy, the biggest thing here is to sort out remote ID, because what just happened last week in Venezuela right now, was it a real deal? What actually happened? Where did the footage come from? Was it a plot? Who knows? But at a certain level, headlines said that drones were used to attack a chief executive of a country. And that's not good PR any way you cut it. Even if the whole thing's debunked, it's not good PR.
That's right. It's hard to forget the headlines.
As these things happen, it's going to become more and more difficult And, there's a whole piece we haven't even talked about with the DHS and the counter UAS stuff. And there's a huge segment. There's like 250 companies now from 20 countries or something that are in the counter UAS market. So there's a whole another discussion happening around that honestly I don't expect to be addressed because, again, the legislative complexities of that are just horrendous. It's not going to happen fast. So, but, there is the CUAS bill from the Senate is now one of the amendments being proposed to go into the Senate reauthorization, and there's let's just say a parallel or companion amendment that has not been included in the House version, but that's going through committee right now. And so if they get to conference where everybody sits down together to negotiate, and it's gone through both sides, I think it's likely that could go through, and that would start at least domestic CUAS on a very limited basis. It's really complicated because the FAA has properly been extremely strict about it, saying, you can't just go taking down stuff in the NAS because you could hurt somebody, And since I'm going to have to fly to Las Vegas to go to Interdrone, I'm kind of reassured about that.
You've been covering the drone industry for about 4 years. What do you see as some of the big milestones in the industry's evolution during this time?
That's a great question. And certainly one thing you can look at is the evolution from when I started, there was no 333. So we've gone from 333, and I think there were 5,000 companies that qualified. And then we've gone to Part 107, and now there's 100,000 of those. I think that people have finally woken up that this is not an $82 billion industry anytime soon, and I have to wonder if once in a while the FAA wish they'd never put that number out there because you can't read anything without reading that number. I think that what I believe, because of standards and because of return on investment, is that the growth of this is not going to be equal. I think that 107 was good as far as it went, but it didn't go far enough. And I think that there's a lot of industries that say, you know what, this having to operate and comply with and be part of the national airspace thing, that kind of, that's out of my wheelhouse and it's out of my comfort zone. And I don't see an overwhelming case for it. So where we're seeing success is what GE originally called the dirty, dangerous, distant, and dull, the high-risk, high-cost inspections, mostly that can be flown within 107 because without BVLOS, you're not going to do power line stuff. But if you've got some guys out on the ground, you can fly a wind farm, you can fly a solar farm, you can fly a lot of those things. And, the safety piece, if you go to things like Energy Drone Coalition Summit, all you hear about from them is, look, if we can get the man off the scaffold, off the ladder, off the roof, out of the sky, off the tower, we're ahead. And that's it. That's such a win right there. If we don't have to put up $1 million worth of scaffold and shut the thing down for a week, that's such a win right there that they'll put up with a lot of stuff. I think that what you're really seeing is that a lot of these kinds of industries have extremely high safety standards anyway. They have extremely precise, demanding risk management practices anyway. And so, to operate in those kinds of environments is, I'm kind of getting a feel for increasing professionalism, if you will, among the people who are really going to deliver that on a week in, week out basis. I think that the people who kind of bought the dream that, they could start a drone business and the world would beat a path to their door, like all new technologies, a few of them will make it who have the business skills, who have the financial skills, who have the sales skills. But I think that there's a lot of people who they don't understand the problem they're being asked to solve, and flying a drone up and down the road isn't going to solve the problem. This is a technology that's a useful extension to an existing toolkit, right? If you're a surveyor, you can survey certain things faster. If it's all the use cases you hear, you can inventory your mine faster, whatever. Now, how far it goes beyond that, that's anybody's guess. And one of the things that never ceases to amaze me, and I'm sure you too, covering the industry the way you do, is, there's constantly new use cases. There's great value to being able to put something up in the air and look down. Is it always economic value? I don't know. There's huge value in the firefighting that's going on right now. The stuff the Department of Interior is doing. There's value with the snot bots collecting stuff from whales in the middle of nowhere. It gives people a useful tool. I did some interviews a couple of years ago now on utility inspection, and I talked to some of the people at Southern at the time, and they were like, all these guys want to come and fly for us and just hand over the stuff, and we don't really need the stuff because we don't have anybody that's time to look at it. And what we finally decided was that we would take volunteers from our own field engineers, our own guys, and if they wanted to get a 107, we'd train them up to work within our environment and to our safety standards and satisfy our legal people. And, they basically put a drone in the truck, and if they think it's a useful thing to do, they'll take it out and use it. I think you've seen that with National Association of Tower Erectors. You're going to see that, where it's like, yeah, I'll fly the drone up there so I can save 2 hours from climbing up and down twice. Is that enough to create a giant new industry? No, I don't think so. I don't think it creates an $82 billion industry, but it creates a lot of value. So I think the adoption is what we're seeing is where people benefit, where there's a clear economic return or a safety return, you see it. And I think that there'll be another set of stuff with BV loss, and then there'll be another set of stuff when it's truly autonomous. And each of those, entails regulatory steps. It entails new levels of equipment, and it's going to include new levels of operator skill. It's going to have new issues with data and communications. And so, it's this sort of everyman kind of drone as a personal computer metaphor, I think, goes away as you get to the more complex operations. It's going to take a bigger engineering investment, bigger maintenance investment, those kinds of things. Again, professionalizing. Even if you look at like the home inspection market, the roof inspection for insurance, there's a lot of sophisticated back end being invested there so that they can automate the estimating and so forth. So, you're not going to pay the guy a lot to drag a drone out there and fly it over the roof, but there's a pretty robust back end to do the estimation after that. That's kind of what I've seen, is it's becoming a lot more sophisticated. It's becoming more polished. It's becoming higher stakes.
And for my final question, Chris, what advice would you give to drone operators at this time?
Unfortunately, we're in a kind of a holding pattern right now, and there's a lot of people who want to go, and it's just, it's not going to happen that fast. But I think that where there's a good business case, there's a lot that can be done now, and certainly the companies that are doing it now and getting into it now and gaining the experience now within their own organization. How do you manage this within my company? What benefits do we get? How do we really integrate it with the rest of our information systems? All those issues, you start early, you get done first, then you get a competitive advantage, and we've seen that with every kind of technology. So I think the companies, that wait on the sideline for the perfect solution, they're going to have some catching up to do. Eventually, it'll be easier to buy it and to do it. But, right now, this is really a roll your own, because once you bring it inside a company, there's a tremendous amount, who are the stakeholders, who tasks the missions, who oversees it, who trains the pilots, how does the data get managed, who interprets it, what's it get rolled up into, who sees the reports. I mean, all that stuff has to be sorted out. And I think that's the companies that have started, that's what they're doing right now.
That's it for episode 173 of the Drone Radio Show. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Chris Korody of the DroneBusiness.Center and getting an update on the UAV legislative and rulemaking initiatives. I want to thank Chris for taking the time to speak with me. If you want to learn more about the DroneBusiness.Center or want to connect with Chris, check out the webpage at DroneBusiness.Center. If you like the Drone Radio Show, please consider supporting the podcast with a small donation. The content is always free, but for as little as $1 per month, you can help defray the cost of production. To donate, go to patreon.com/Drone Radio Show. And thanks for listening. Your support means a lot to me, and I hope you'll listen to more episodes of the Drone Radio Show podcast to hear how others are using drones for business, fun, and research. For the Drone Radio Show, I'm Randy Gores.
This has been the Drone Radio Show podcast. More information on today's show can be found on our website at www.droneradioshow.com. If you're using drone technology for business, fun, or research and would like to share your experience on the show, please visit our website and fill out a guest appearance application. And don't forget to follow us on your favorite social media channels.